Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today in this timely conversation. My name is Flasmeli Leon DePass. I am the Georgetown Women's Law and Public Policy Fellow for Reproductive Health at the National Partnership of Women and Families, and a member of the Health Justice team working on maternal health and reproductive health issues. I'm also a proud member. I'm also a member to be in the team behind this project and the report that we'll be discussing today called the Clean Water and Reproductive Justice, Lack of Access Harm Women of Color. So the webinar will run as follows. We will begin with remarks and a discussion with our presenters, and then we will be joined at the end for a Q&A question. Feel free throughout this conversation to send your questions through the chat. We will be monitoring them and we will respond at the end of our conversation. So throughout this conversation, please use the hashtags color of water, hashtag clean water, and hashtag intersections of our lives if you're posting on social media. So let's begin this conversation by discussing how Clean Water and Reproductive Justice Project came about. Access to clean water is critical to our daily lives. People need water to drink, to bathe, to wash their hands, to cook, to survive, and ultimately to prosper. Yet during our research, we discovered that every day, millions of people living in the United States are exposed to contaminated water sources that present serious risks to reproductive and overall health. Black, Latinx, Asian American, and Pacific Islander communities, lower income communities, rural communities, communities living in intersections of these realities struggle daily to access safe and affordable water. And their health is disproportionately harmed. The Intersections of Our Lives, a collaborative of In Our Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda, the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, and the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice commissioned a nationwide poll to understand what motivated women of color to vote and the issues they care about the most. The poll explored the views of Black, Latinx, and Asian American Pacific Islander women and voters and revealed that clean water was a top issue, with 62% saying that ensuring access to clean water is extremely important. Grounded on this polling data, we partnered with In Our Voice, NABOF, and the Sierra Club to study the environmental and reproductive injustices experienced by Black, Latinx, Asian American, and Pacific Islander communities as a result of not having access to clean and affordable water, issues that had unfortunately become more urgent during this COVID-19 pandemic. We hope this report will sound the alarm and encourage further the collaboration and intersectional advocacy on these issues. So without further ado, let's go ahead and introduce our policy experts. Up first, we have Lexi White, who's the Senior Policy Manager in the Government Affairs Department at In Our Voice National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda, a national and state partnership of 8 Black women-led reproductive justice organizations whose work centers the voices of Black women leaders at the national, regional, and state levels in an ongoing policy fight to achieve reproductive justice for all. Next, we have Jennifer Wang, who's the Deputy Director of Programs at the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, the only multi-issue progressive community organizing and policy advocacy organization for Asian American and Pacific Islander women and girls in the United States. And last, we have Sonia Lunder, who is a Senior Toxic Policy Advisor for the Sierra Club Genders Equity Program. Her advocacy focuses on the health impacts of toxic chemicals on people and communities, particularly women and children. So our first question goes to Lexi. Thank you, Lexi, for being here today. So let's ground this conversation on the center part of our project, which is environmental and structural racism. And we know that it has a critical impact on people's lives. Can you tell us what environmental racism is and how it has played out historically and presently in a way that jeopardizes access to clean water and overall health?
Sure. Thank you, Blasmeli, for your introduction and everyone for joining this conversation today. Environmental racism describes a set of intersectional structural conditions that are disproportionately lethal, harmful, and hazardous to the health and well-being of Indigenous, Black, and Brown people, their families, and the communities that they live in. It includes everything from historical and contemporary forced land seizure and land colonization, violations of land sovereignty agreements, and gentrification, which displaces Black and Brown communities, as well as discrimination in terms of lack of adequate political representation for Black and Brown communities in the neighborhoods and environments where they live. Policies such as redlining and other structural processes of unfair zoning, often that take form in state and local ordinances that fall across race and gender lines in terms of their impact, have historically, but also in the context of the Great Migration and the earliest 20th century, but also continue to today, create a sharp disparity between land that is considered desirable and land that is considered less desirable and often closer to industrial toxics, plants and waste from industrial plants that contaminates land and water. Black and Brown people historically have been forced to live closer to toxic waste plants, and toxic waste plants have been built closer to where Black and Brown communities have formed and have inhabited. And this also occurred as Black folks were migrating away from rural environments to move to urban environments in search of employment opportunities. But this is a phenomenon that continues today, particularly in urban environments. Environmental racism distinctly includes the deliberate targeting of Indigenous, Black, and Brown communities with hazardous waste outputs, poisons and pollutants, as well as the fact that Indigenous, Black, and Brown leaders have historically been kept out of what you might consider mainstream environmental movements, despite the fact that these in our communities have always led the charge to protect land sovereignty and to protect our land and water, as well as responding to other environmental threats on multiple fronts. In this time, in this moment, environmental threats also include a health pandemic, of course, that still is spreading rapidly and that has killed Black people overwhelmingly. We can't discount this reality and the fact that in this hot summer, as temperatures continue to rise as a result of climate change and global warming, where Black and Brown people who may be living with pre-existing conditions are also out in the heat, not only working in outdoor environments, but also protesting the unlawful killings of Black trans women and Black people to gender-based and state-sanctioned violence alike. All of this contributes to environmental racism and environments that make it more difficult for us to raise healthy families in safe and sustainable, healthy living environments. When we are the ones on the front lines in the heat and in a health pandemic fighting for justice, what does it mean that we don't have access to safe drinking water to hydrate, that our water bills are unaffordable, not only because of a striking wage gap, but because of economic constraints that are exacerbated in the context of a global health pandemic? All of these realities factor into our decision-making about pregnancy and parenting, and all of them contribute to reproductive health and pregnancy risks and maternal health outcomes that may be adverse in real time, but also over time for our communities.
Thank you so much for that and for clearly connecting what we often and people often separate, but really it's the intersection of our lives in terms of like how it all connects and how it all impacts us. And without a doubt, the expression that we see in the poll with 62% finding this issue to be extremely could be resulted from all the forced experiences that within their communities and what they're seeing every day. So thank you for that, Lexi. Jennifer, can you tell us a little bit about the Intersections of Our Lives Collaborative, why it was formed, and where access to clean water fits within the reproductive justice framework? Also, can you touch a little bit about the barriers to accessing clean water and how that manifests as a reproductive oppression, and jeopardizes reproductive and overall health for communities that already face disproportionate health barriers?
Absolutely. Thank you to Blasmeli and all the other panelists. So we've always known that unsafe water can be particularly detrimental to health. We've always known that prenatal and early childhood development are absolutely within the realm of health. And even low-level exposure to toxins in water have a variety of detrimental effects on children, on mothers, including, permanent damage to the nervous system, behavioral issues, learning issues, and other health effects, including fertility problems, premature birth, and miscarriage. So, none topics were addressed by the reproductive rights community, and particularly were missing a racial justice lens or a racial justice analysis for years. Our three organizations that came together as Intersections of Our Lives sprouted this collaborative out of a movement that did not always center the needs of women of color. And so our three organizations believe that reproductive justice is a human rights framework that should be used to address and dismantle systemic barriers that affect people's ability to make decisions regarding their bodies, their families, and their communities. And as Lexi's already laid out, we absolutely believe that environmental racism is a reproductive justice issue because reproductive justice is rooted in three main principles: the individual's right to have a child, along with the conditions under which to give birth, the individual's right to not have a child, including access to all options for ending or preventing pregnancy and to be treated dignity throughout all of those options, and the individual's right to parent children that they have in safe, supportive communities free from violence and oppression. Our three organizations have worked together for 5 years on a number of policy areas through this intersectional reproductive justice lens. As Lexi said, we did do a poll, and while women of color voters' priorities are certainly not monolithic, there is significant common ground based on our inequality, our experiences with discrimination because of our skin color, the language we speak, our last names, our immigration statuses, and being able to overcome great barriers to just simply exist. And while Lexi will discuss the poll results in reference to clean water more fully, to sum up some of the reasons why we did this poll, we've known for a long time that women of color understand policy reforms intersectionally. And 9 in 10 women of color think that if women are able to control if, when, and how she has children, this then provides individual and societal benefits, not just on the women, but their children and the broader community. So for example, we've always believed that addressing one problem like clean water would yield other benefits in our lives, including our reproductive lives.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Lexi, can you add on in terms of the polling data that you've done and how data has captured the deeper interrogation of the intersections between clean water and reproductive justice?
Yes. So in April of 2019, the Intersections of Our Lives Collaborative released new polling data that really demonstrates the power of Black, Latinx, and Asian American Pacific Islander women voters as well as their sentiments on political priorities across a whole range of issues. So this research followed the 2018 election, where women of color really voted at historic levels. And the poll included interviews from 2,663 adult women randomly sampled who were identified as Black or African American, Hispanic or Latina, or of Spanish-speaking background, and Asian American or Pacific Islander. Again, these were registered voters who were surveyed. And the interviews were made available in a handful of different languages, including English, Spanish, Mandarin, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Korean, and were administered via telephone. As Jen said, we already know that women of color voters' voting priorities are not monolithic. But it's really interesting to see where we found common ground across issues for women of color communities. This particular survey found that 65% of women of color combined and 70% of Black women considered having access to clean water extremely important for Congress to take action on. It landed as in the top 3 political priorities across communities. And for Black women specifically, it ranked 3rd, next to the extreme importance of ending racial, ethnic, and cultural discrimination, and ensuring that people who are living with pre-existing conditions can still get health insurance and access to healthcare more broadly. For AAPI women, specifically, ensuring access to clean water was actually ranked the top political priority, which may be surprising to some. We also have some results from a national survey of Black adults, which is, these results are a bit older, date back to 2017, but Black adults on the lives and voices of Black America at the intersections of politics, race, and public policy. This was a bit of a smaller survey in that it polled 1,003 Black adults ages 18 and older in the summer of 2017. But what we found here was that 1 in 3 respondents reported having had brown water come out of their taps at home. Approximately 30% of respondents here had water that felt unsafe from the taps at home. 35% and 50% respectively had to boil water before drinking it, and also said that having access to clean water has been a leading factor in deciding and decision-making about whether and when to become a parent. I think what's also really noteworthy in this study is that these numbers go up as we identify the relationship of racism at play. So 57% explicitly noted racism was to blame as a key factor that contributed to Black people's inability to access clean water. And those numbers are upwards of 70% with preventing racism's role in preventing access to other kinds of neighborhood environmental services like trash cleanup, getting streets and sidewalks fixed, getting parks taken care of, and most notably the over-policing of Black communities, which certainly create unsafe environments for Black families and Black children in combination with contaminated water. So just wanted to share those results. And you can also read more of the Intersections of Our Lives polling at intersectionsofourlives.org.
Thank you so much for sharing that incredible data, Lexi. Jennifer, can we narrow in a little bit and can we discuss some of the racial, given the responses AAPI find this to be their top political priority, what are some racial and socioeconomic factors affecting clean water access and the ways that this has impacted Asian American and Pacific Islander communities?
Yeah, I think the number one myth to shatter is just that Asian American and Pacific Islander people are not model minorities. 1 in 8 Asian Americans live in poverty. When you disaggregate that data to examine communities within that broad umbrella term, 1 in 5 Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders live in poverty, and 1 in 4 Micronesian people live in poverty. And so I think, as Lexi said, the cost of being able to obtain clean water is immensely difficult for a pretty large subset of the AAPI community in the United States. It's also worth noting that we face significant barriers to adequate health care. We know clean water is a health issue. We need clean water to wash our hands, to cook our food, to bathe in. And yet, for many of us, because of our immigration statuses, we cannot access affordable health care. So there are policy barriers for AAPI immigrants in particular, where even if we go through the proper channels, we have to wait 5 years before becoming eligible to enroll in programs like Medicaid and CHIP, which forces many AAPI immigrants to rely on a patchwork of services to receive just basic health care. Meanwhile, because of the current administration's attack on immigrant families, the public charge rule, for instance, has deterred many immigrants from seeking the care that they need, even if they would actually be able to obtain that care regardless of this rule. So attacks on immigrant families are having a chilling effect on people's ability to even access the care that they need, despite deeply understanding that clean water is a health issue. As Lexi said, women of color face significant wage gaps, which make it hard to access clean water. In particular, the Southeast Asian American community and the Pacific Islander community, if you examine the wage gap among those women workers, they're making wages as low as 50 cents to the white male dollar. And certain refugee communities, for instance, the Hmong and Cambodian communities in the United States, on average earn between 61 cents and 57 cents to the white male dollar. And if you look at other communities, some of those data points are even lower. And so it's also worth noting that that wage gap is even wider for AAPI women who are mothers. And we all know, we've already discussed how clean water is an issue for women of color's ability to be able to have a healthy pregnancy, to be able to raise families. And for the 44% of AAPI women in this country who are moms and also breadwinners, this is a significant barrier that they're living out every day of their lives. It's also worth noting that there are pretty distinct language and cultural barriers that AAPI people face. So 1 in 5 Asian American households are linguistically isolated. You can imagine how difficult it must be to access clean water if English is not your first language and you are one of the people in this country who is linguistically isolated. In the United States, it's becoming very common to see resources and services available for people who speak English and perhaps people who speak Spanish. But of course, we need to do a better job of that. It's even worse for immigrant communities who are API, because very frequently nothing is translated into our languages, including water advisories. And, I think it's worth noting that in the report in particular, there is a case study about the San Gabriel Valley, which is a region just outside of downtown Los Angeles. This is actually a region that I spent every summer of my childhood. It's only 200 square miles. It is home to rampant pollution. And it is also one of the densest AAPI regions in the United States. All of the cities that comprise San Gabriel Valley have very, very large percentages of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Already in this region, AAPI people are more likely to die of cancer than any other racial group in this region. And 1 in 5 Asian Americans in this area do not have a regular source of health care. This region is, like I said, very polluted. And so people who live there are exposed to high levels of pollution, not only in their water, but also in their air, which we know has already led to respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, increased risks for poor birth outcomes among pregnant women. And just to get even more granular, in Alhambra, which is one city in this region, which is 50% AAPI, there's groundwater contamination levels as much as 1,000 times the maximum contaminant level allowed by state and law. And both high doses of this water and small doses over a long period of time are linked to liver and kidney damage, linked to compromised immune systems, linked to fetal development problems and blue baby syndrome, and of course, like I mentioned already, cancer. So it is no mystery why when you poll AAPI women voters, clean water is the top concern. This has also been found in other polls. There was another poll by the California League of Conservation Voters Education Fund, specifically about the Asian American community. And in that poll, they found something very similar. AAPI voters place a very high value on issues like air pollution and water supply, because as you can see from this case study, we are living it in every single day of our lives, and it's having an impact in every area of our lives.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for really sharing all of these factors that are often overseen and really, really important to understand as we move forward and really having this discussion and the intersectionalities of it. So Sonia, moving a little bit in your direction, a huge part of the report is talking about infrastructure, and we talked about environmental racism and all of the systemic situations that are placed in our communities. So can you tell us a little bit some of the factors that inhibit equitable access to clean water for many communities of color? And in more in depth, like how has deregulation and lack of infrastructure impacted access to clean water for communities of color?
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. It's a real honor to be on this panel and bring in some of the work that we're doing on water access and quality. So as has been really clearly demonstrated, we're living in a country where there are vast differences in the price and the quality of drinking water. And like all other aspects of the United States, we see very clearly that structural racism has a huge role in this dynamic. Since the 1970s, the federal government has been spending a lot less money to maintain public water services. Some say up to a 70% drop in the amount of money that's available. That means less money available to replace old lead-based water pipes, which are common in older houses and neighborhoods, have a disproportionate impact on the Black community and urban communities. And as we know, lead has a lifetime impact on children's learning, memory, and behavior. It means less water quality monitoring for people who live in rural areas, who drink water from private wells or other small systems, mobile home parks. And it also means that that cost of removing harmful chemicals from water falls to the water system and is passed on to customers. So too often there's this tragic trade-off between really high quality clean water and water bills that are too high for the lowest income people in the community to afford. We know that this impacts people of color much more dramatically. The newspaper, The Guardian, did an in-depth analysis of water bills and found that there was about an 80% increase in the cost of combined water and sewer bills in 12 major cities in the US over just the last 8 years. And that up to 40% of residents in some of these cities can't afford their water bill. A water bill should be no more than about 4% of a family's overall income. And these skyrocketing costs have a huge effect on people who get behind on their water bills. They can lose their house. Single parents can lose custody of their children if they don't have running water. And if you remain in a house with no running water, there's an huge amount of money and time that you have to spend then buying and bringing water home. It is way more expensive than the water bills. So environmental groups like my own have traditionally focused on water quality. There's a lot of problems with water quality monitoring. There's a lot of systems that don't comply with the rules. There was a lack of enforcement during the COVID crisis. The federal government announced that they weren't going to be enforcing major environmental rules. But it's the advocacy of women of color, both in urban communities and rural communities, and among our own staff, who really raised the visibility of this issue and called for a comprehensive need to address both water quality and the cost. During the COVID crisis, we sprung into action to make sure that we could stop water shutoffs and actually reconnect water systems. And that's advocacy that happens to the companies themselves, but also at the state level, making sure that there's money in infrastructure bills to set up permanent systems to subsidize water bills for lower income communities. This can't only be done in a crisis. It can't be done voluntarily. And often the income levels that are set by water companies for water assistance are really, really low. And we know, families that have some income still can't afford water and are falling desperately behind. So yeah, this is a place where Sierra Club as a national group really partners with the grassroots leaders who've led this struggle. We lend our hand in lobbying state and federal governments for money and for support. And we want to make sure that these crises, like the one we're facing with COVID, prompt the real re-examination of the equity and the long-term supports that we can offer communities to make sure that no one has to trade off between buying food and diapers and paying their water bills, that families aren't losing custody and all these other tragic outcomes that happen when water is too expensive to afford.
So in addition to lack of infrastructure and what that results in, how that impacts water, how does contaminated water impact reproductive and overall health?
Yeah, thank you. We know that millions of people are drinking water with contamination level that is high enough to impact their body and their health. And most impacted, clearly, time and again, are women and people who are pregnant, and then children. We know that the chemicals in drinking water can impair ability to get pregnant, to deliver a healthy baby. Babies are born premature, they're born with low birth weight, which leads to a lot of other lifetime health impacts. And that also those exposures during gestation can affect both the brain, the reproductive systems, the mammary, breast development, and even the long-term effects on the immune system that will manifest during childhood and really change a child's overall body and how it functions and how it's healthy. We know whether or not an infant is breastfed or bottle fed, they have more exposure to contaminants in water. A bottle fed baby drinks like 3 to 5 times more water per day based on their small body size than they will at any other point. And this is a time of life where the body systems are really underdeveloped and they can't efficiently break down those chemicals and get them out of their body. They're more taken up and held longer, and they have a more harmful effect. Contaminants also concentrate in mother's milk. And so another reason that we have to solve this problem systematically. It's not just about choosing one thing or another. There's a lot of information about lead and the impact of lead on kids' behavior. We know this is a dramatic impact on urban communities in the African American community due to lack of investment in infrastructure and cleaning up lead pipes and lead paint. But we also know from the Flint, Michigan crisis that it's this reckless negligence on the part of water quality managers and racism that leads to really bad decision making. And another tragic outcome was a real drop in community fertility and an increase in fetal death that was noted in the Flint water crisis, showing that, that this has a really dramatic impact in real life. Of course, we know Flint was not an isolated incident, and the issues on water quality threats really vary depending on who you are and where you live. In rural areas, there's pesticide use, and a lot more people drinking water from wells that isn't monitored or filtered. Those pesticides can affect pregnancy and many of the outcomes that I mentioned earlier. Arsenic is a naturally occurring contaminant that causes cancer. It also suppresses the immune system, and nitrates in agricultural areas can be especially harmful to bottle-fed babies. People living near industrial sites have a variety of pollutants in their water. Some of these are not regulated or tested for or monitored and filtered out of water. People have no information or very little information about whether or not they've been exposed, and no legal protections. These include a type of rocket fuel called perchlorate, PFAS or Teflon chemicals, which are heavily impacting communities near military bases, airports, or other industrial sites. And then when water is degraded through land practices and comes into water treatment systems more dirty, with more organic material in it, it takes more chlorine to treat it. And actually that chlorination or disinfecting, killing viruses and bacteria actually has a downside of creating more cancer-causing chlorination byproducts. So one final impact, of course, this is a hard section of the conversation, but contaminated water also leads to pollution of fish and shellfish. And this is a place where we see a lot of impacts in tribal communities, in the Asian Pacific Islander communities. Anyone who's catching and eating local fish in a contaminated area then has a lot more impact from the local water pollution because it's taken up in the body the fish or shellfish, and that includes mercury and a lot of pesticides and persistent contaminants. So in addition to thinking about clean water for us drinking directly, we need to remember that that's an important food source for so many communities in the United States and a place for a lot of disproportionate impacts and exposures.
Thank you so much, Sonia. So we're getting close to the end. I would like to remind if anybody has questions, please add them to the question Q&A box, and we'll be trying to answer as most we can towards the end. But just circling back to something that Lexi raised earlier was COVID and how this is all has been exacerbated. And we already knew that there was this crisis of lack of access to clean water, and that historically health disparities for people of color and economically disadvantaged communities have been historically disadvantaged from this. So can you tell us a little bit, how does contamination, including from water, impact COVID risk?
Yeah, COVID has really shined a light on a lot of the pre-existing struggles and ways racism exerts itself in the United States, including poverty, access to health care, even the ability to stay home and avoid harmful exposure to COVID outside of the house. One thing that isn't getting as much attention necessarily is the role of pollution in making our bodies more vulnerable to catching COVID or recovering more slowly. There is some really strong conversations and acknowledgement of the role of air pollution, which is experienced more intensely in communities of color across the US. But it's also important to note that contaminants in water, and many of the ones that I mentioned earlier, can also weaken the immune system and make the immune system less able to fight off infections, both either getting COVID or also recovering quickly. And that there's a lot of secrecy surrounding what kind of contaminants are in people's water. And it's hard for people to make that visible. There's not a lot of research, but we know arsenic, lead, PFAS chemicals that I mentioned earlier, all suppress the immune system. Other impacts of chemicals increase some of the underlying conditions like diabetes, cancer, asthma, obesity, that also make COVID risks more severe.
Thank you, Sonia. And Jennifer, Lexi, do you want to add in terms of like, how does COVID-19 pandemic affected communities of color? How has this impact, how is it connected to environmental racism?
Yeah, so the COVID-19 pandemic has shed a very bright light on deep racial and ethnic disparities in our healthcare system. And of course, as Lexi has said, is an environmental justice issue. And I know, Sonia, you've already spoken at length about why that is. I mean, many AAPI people were already living in poverty, already working in frontline jobs. That has only been exacerbated due to the pandemic. What isn't getting a lot of attention is that Asian Americans are actually facing a very high COVID-19 case fatality rate. In San Francisco, I think this trend has gone largely unnoticed. Asian Americans account for half of the coronavirus deaths. I think that the racial disparities for all communities of color have been talked about, and yet very little is being done to address them. Even still, data from LA County and data from Illinois suggests that Asian Americans are receiving disproportionately low rates of COVID-19 testing and already are infected at much higher rates. So for instance, in South Dakota, where you wouldn't even assume that there are that many Asian Americans, we account for 2% of the population, but 12% of the cases. California, Oregon, Utah, and Washington, in particular, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders have an infection rate that's 2 to 3 times the state's average. Like I've already said, API women in particular make up a significant portion of frontline workers, particularly in food-related industries. And many of these jobs lack access to paid leave, paid sick days, which we know are crucial in a pandemic. So all of these things converge along with lack of access to clean water to produce a lot more inequity.
Thank you. Lexi, do you want to add or?
Well, I would echo what the other speakers have shared in terms of COVID-19 being the thing that is exacerbating health disparities where they already exist, while simultaneously straining health systems in terms of large numbers of people being in health systems, but also large numbers of people who already have difficulty getting regular prenatal care, primary care, and other routine reproductive health care, may be that much more deterred from seeking care, given some of the health and safety concerns that come with COVID-19. On the political side of things, we're also seeing a lot of voter suppression in the context of COVID-19. And one of our key recommendations, around this project, and certainly through the Intersections of Our Lives project collaborative, is that we want to see women of color leaders being the voices of change at every level of government around issues that are disproportionately impacting their communities. And in the context of COVID-19, where folks are staying home or don't have flexible ways and options to make sure that their vote is casted, we are fearful at this time that could have an impact on electoral outcomes come November, and already as we're seeing in primary races. So I think that's also an important connection and point of concern in the context of COVID-19.
Thank you so much, Lexi. So we're on to the last question. If you have any more questions, please feel free to add. So we've discussed quite a bit, and we've discussed inequities, environmental racism, infrastructure, and all these things that we've highlighted in our brief to be really crucial for access, and how that is just fundamental in order to achieve reproductive justice. So I want to go around and ask each panelist to lift up one or two recommendations that you really want people to take up. And I will start with Lexi, and then followed by Sonia, and then Jennifer.
Sure. So in addition to the policy recommendations to improve water quality, we want to continue to lift up policy recommendations that are going to expand reproductive health care broadly for impacted communities. For Black women in particular, it is urgent that we expand the quality and access to maternal health care, and address the social determinants of health that are contributing to an environment where we are 3 to 4 times more likely than our white counterparts to die of pregnancy-related causes. And so that urgently, includes the Federal Momnibus Act of 2020 and the Social Determinants for Moms Act specifically in this package, which mandates more studies on the impact of water and air quality, as well as extreme temperatures and pollution on infant and maternal health outcomes. Furthermore, I probably sound like a broken record in saying this, but we need to also continue to call out the hypocrisy that we have lawmakers who are making it their business to push things like abortion healthcare out of reach, while simultaneously not responding to the environmental realities that are at play, that make it dangerous in certain environments for us to both birth and raise healthy families. And so we want to see the elimination of Medicaid barriers for abortion coverage through the passage of the Each Woman Act, as well as an eradication of targeted regulation attacks against abortion providers, including gestational limits, but not limited to gestational limits, by passing federal standard against that through the Women's Health Protection Act. These are just to name a few. I would also add that diverting funds from institutions that are causing state violence and reallocating that money to programs that are focused on health and birth justice, and also water quality would also be a step in the right direction.
Thanks. And I would add, while our organization comes, from it looking at water quality and affordability, we're really strongly in support of these reproductive justice goals and partnerships and access issues. From the Sierra Club side, we work on water quality, improving the water for everyone, making sure that we're minimizing the impacts of water contamination on people's health, but this lens of affordability and not making it a false trade-off between clean and healthy water and then water people can afford is a critical priority. On the water shutoffs and access issues, right now, there's an urgent need to get involved either with water companies, with your city, state, or these federal funding packages to make sure that people who have lost their jobs and lost their income because of the COVID crisis don't also end up losing water and ultimately, potentially their families and their homes. So there's lots of ways to get involved and making sure that those questions that the COVID crisis is prompting lead to answers that are permanent and are not voluntary but mandatory supports for water bills and infrastructure investments.
And I would say two of my recommendations would be for Congress to seriously look at and pass the Water Affordability, Transparency, Equity, and Reliability Act, which is the Water Act. We included this bill and have done advocacy around this bill as Intersections of Our Lives, which is, of course, the 3 organizations we've mentioned. It was introduced in early 2019. It makes water service safer, more affordable, and more accessible for both urban and rural communities. It provides funding to replace lead service lines, which we've discussed on this panel. And those lines go into homes, and it would also remove lead pipes and plumbing in schools. There have been questions in the Q&A about the Navajo people and Indigenous people. This bill would actually expand funding for technical assistance to small, rural, and Indigenous communities, in addition to creating a water trust fund and $35 billion a year to drinking water and wastewater improvements. I will mention that, unfortunately, it is a very real criticism of our collaboration and our polling data that we were not able to include Indigenous communities in that data. And so our polling results, which we've discussed on this call, do not include Indigenous people, which is unfortunate. And so there is a resource, the Navajo Water Project. We can link to this resource in the chat, that is working to provide access to running water to the Navajo people in particular. But it is absolutely a fair criticism. We did not poll Indigenous people for this poll, but without question, clean water is affecting those communities, and we do need to do something about it as a country. But our poll did not cover those voices, and it is something that we want to improve. I will also mention, we've discussed immigrant people's access to clean water on this during this event. We lead a coalition of more than 250 organizations nationwide to pass the Heal for Immigrant Women and Families Act, which would, of course, open affordable access to health care to immigrants regardless of their immigration status. And given that so many immigrants are frontline workers, so many immigrants are among those who are testing at very, very high rates for COVID, and so many immigrants are among those who are dying from this pandemic, it is absolutely something that Congress should consider passing, because there's no reason why immigrants shouldn't have healthcare access.
Thank you so much for those recommendations. So moving on to audience questions. Audience are asking, a member of audience is asking, how do you recommend advocates continue to shed light on these intersection issues? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
I guess I would say, coming from an environmental background, has been a real point of learning growth and awareness to realize that, historically advocacy we've done to make water cleaner has only exacerbated or ignored the issues of access and affordability. So we've learned a lot. As I mentioned, that learning comes at the, at the behest of women of color and grassroots leaders who have pushed and fought and brought that to, big national groups. And to me, deep learning of the fact that we risk, not solving the problems for lower income communities and people of color when we focus on just one piece of an overall issue. Clean, affordable, and healthy water can't be fragmented, and you can't just win on one piece of that. We need to think about it together. So I credit our grassroots relationships and our women of color on staff and people of color on staff of Sierra Club for really broadening and deepening that commitment and that advocacy.
Thank you, Sonia. So this question, I think, Sonia, probably back to you. Are there any resources you recommend to assist folks with water testing, or any advocacy resources for folks living in households with contaminated water?
Water testing is really expensive, and so it's not something that I think individual people necessarily benefit from. We're trying to change systems to ensure that this work is done at the community, state, and national level. Water shutoffs are a big issue. There are some good online databases showing what's happening at the utility level and at the state and national level for people. So actually, I don't have those handy. I would say people could contact me or be in touch with you, and I'll connect them to the specific information about what's happening in their state or with their water provider.
Thank you, Sonia. Lexi, I'll pitch this one to you. How has lack of access to clean water affected maternal health and maternal mortality in the U.S.?
Sure. So it has impacted maternal health significantly in conjunction with a range of issues that are impacting maternal health, including maternal environmental racism, including disproportionate barriers to adequate coverage and care for Black women at all points in pregnancy and also in the postpartum period. But it also, in conjunction with the exposure to high temperatures, air pollution, and what scientists are characterizing as the heat island effect, in conjunction with being closer to industrial pollutants and waste, this directly impacts Black maternal health through resulting premature births, low birth weight, increased likelihood of stillbirth, higher risk pregnancies, and all of the data around this is higher for women and people who are living with pre-existing health conditions. Again, I can't emphasize enough that all of this compounds with the structural barriers to care that we see, and the ways that economic injustice makes it hard to access comprehensive care throughout pregnancy.
Thank you, Lexi. And there's been an ask if you could repeat the policies that you mentioned earlier that would protect reproductive health of women of color.
Yes, so those policies were the Each Woman Act, the Women's Health Protection Act, and the Federal Black Maternal Health Omnibus Act, which is actually a package of 8 or 9 different bills. The Clean Water Bill within that package that seeks to gain more data about water and air quality and extreme temperatures and their impact on maternal and infant health outcomes is the Social Determinants for Moms Act.
Thank you so much. And so there's a question, and I'm not sure who would be able to answer this one, but can you speak to some of the long-term harms that might occur when reproductive healthcare visits are delayed?
Sure, I can take this one. So reproductive health is expansive, and during reproductive health visits, there is cancer screenings, there are blood pressure screenings, like a whole host of healthcare occurs at a reproductive healthcare visit. When those are delayed, it makes it harder for people to catch conditions that they might have that will exacerbate over time. It also makes it harder for pregnant people to have a healthy pregnancy without prenatal screenings. And of course, with pregnant people who want to end their pregnancies, the longer they wait, the harder it is to actually get an abortion in the United States, not just in terms of cost, but in terms of other barriers. So the time is of the essence when it comes to multiple factors that can affect a person's reproductive health. Of course, as I said, reproductive health is expansive. A very large percentage of people actually get their health care primarily in a reproductive health care setting. And so it is a necessity that people have that cannot wait. I also see a question here to repeat the water bill that I previously mentioned, and I'll just do that now. It is the Water Act. So WATER, water is the acronym, introduced in early 2019. The full name is the Water Affordability, Transparency, Equity, and Reliability Act.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And we have one last question. And I think this one might be a little hard to answer or pick favorites, but what is the most inspiring grassroots organizing led by most impacted communities that you have seen to advance water equity locally and nationally?
Yeah, this is a heartbreaker because I think if we could open it up to the audience, we'd get dozens of names. We at Sierra Club have had strong partnerships and been inspired by the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization, the People's Water Board, and We the People Detroit. That's hats off to Detroit for showing up and raising this issue and its effect it's had nationally. We've been inspired by the Community Water Center in Central California dealing with access and issue in the Latinx community. But man, I feel like I could pick a state and name organizations because this issue has been lifted out of the grassroots based on the experience of low-income communities, people of color, and women leaders all over. And of course, not even starting on the tribal lands, water access issues.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing, Sonia. And I think, you know, if anybody has more questions or any specific thoughts that we didn't cover here, we're open to provide some resources and continue this conversation. I really want to thank our panelists for your partnership in this incredible project and for being a speaker in this webinar today, and also for everybody who joined during this webinar and engage in this conversation. That really will start a very productive discussion on how clean water really impacts the ability of people to choose if and when how to have a family. So I encourage everyone to read and download the entire report, and you can find the report at nationalpartnership.org/cleanwater. And also stay tuned for future discussions. This is truly an introductory to this work, and we really want to continue to engage proactively through the course of this time. So thank you all so much. We really appreciate your time here today, and I hope you stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.